And now it's time for another Dice Tower review with Mike Vincent.
Hello, Michael Vincent here, and today we're taking a look at the newest expansion, The Voice of Isengard, for Lord of the Rings living card game. So I just was able to pick this up. My local game store was a little late getting this on the shelves. I've been periodically going back and looking for it every couple days, but I was very glad to see it there this weekend. And so taking a look today at the player cards for Voice of Isengard. There's two new heroes, both of which are pretty interesting, and of course a nice assortment of new player cards as well. So please keep in mind, I haven't had a chance to really play with these. I was able to play the first quest this morning and experiment with some of the new cards, but most of them are relatively untested at this point. So this video will be mostly giving you my first impressions, how I think these cards will play out, but perhaps, some cards always end up surprising you, and some cards gain a lot more utility later on when new cards come out that combo well with them. So anyways, two new heroes, a bunch of new cards, some of which I've played with, so let's jump right in and take a look at the Voice of Isengard. Okay, so our first new hero we see here is a tactics hero, and this of course is Eomer. Eomer has 10 starting threat, has 1 willpower, 3 attack, 2 defense, and 4 hit points. He has the keywords Rohan, Noble, and Warrior, and his ability reads Response. After a character leaves play, Eomer gets 2 attack until the end of the round, limit once per round. So we have a very capable attacker here in Eomer, and a nice addition to the Rohan sphere, which has largely been dominated by Spirit, but we have seen some new tactics additions for Rohan. And so I think Eomer, whether you're playing a solo tactics or maybe a tactics spirit, he works very well. We know for Rohan, particularly with the spirit allies, a lot of them do have to leave play to trigger their ability. So this is going to give Eomer a pretty solid attack at 5, and so he's going to be able to deal with enemies quite nicely. And keep in mind, of course, this is before any attachments. So you put a few weapons on this guy, and Eomer is going to be a force to be reckoned with in the attacking department. Has solid stats otherwise. 2 defense could come in handy occasionally. 4 hit points is solid. Probably won't be doing a whole lot of questing with him. Of course, we've seen King Theoden can give +1 willpower for tactics heroes, so this of course would apply to Eomer as well. But I think whether you're playing a tactics spirit and he would be your designated attacker, or if eventually you're able to sort of play a tactics Rohan deck, I think there's enough allies that leave play, or if you're in a combat heavy quest and you're going to have characters dying anyways, then Eomer is going to be able to use ability quite regularly. So you're going to have to deck build around this a little bit to ensure that you have allies that will be leaving play somewhat regularly. This will also work well with sneak attack, with the Gandalfs coming in and out, and some other characters who we'll be taking a look at later. So Eomer, very solid, really nice art as well. I think this is a really nice card. So I haven't played with this one yet, but looking forward to getting to try Eomer. So our second hero is certainly an interesting one, probably an example of Fantasy Flight getting very creative. And here we have Grima. So of course, we know if you've read the books, the movies, Grima Wormtongue. So Grima is a lore hero, has a starting threat of 9, which is nice, a little bit lower, and has 2 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, and 3 hit points. Has the keywords Rohan and Isengard, and action reads, lower the cost of the next card you play from your hand this round by 1. That card gains Doomed 1, limit once per round. So this is going to be something that veteran players are probably going to really find interesting to play around with, as it definitely is a unique ability, but it's also going to be a card that might scare a lot of people away. On the one hand, lore is not something that... They do have some more expensive cards. There's lots in the 3, 4, and 5 range. So unless you're playing secrecy with secrecy cards, they can be a little harder to afford. And of course, you don't have as much resource generation in lore as well. So Grima is going to be a way to reduce the cost of cards, making them cheaper, more affordable. But of course, that means that when you do play those cards, they will have 1 threat for you and any other players you're playing with as well. And that can certainly be problematic. So you're going to have to weigh, to what extent is it worth increasing my threat, and how many times can I do this over the course of the game, versus getting cards, potentially very good cards, for cheap. So you're really going to have to look at your deck, look at your players, who else is playing and what decks they're playing. Of course, the more players you're playing with, the worse this card gets, because you're affecting everyone's threat, whereas if you're playing solo, of course, you're just affecting your own. So total threat amount is going to change based on the amount of players. And of course, you're going to want to factor in how much threat reduction do I have available to me? So of course, if you're playing Lore Aragorn, who can reset your threat, well, he might be a very nice complement to Grima because you're going to be able to use his ability quite a bit. Perhaps your partner is playing Spirit and they have lots of cards for threat reduction as well. So it may not be so much of a problem. But again, if you don't build in threat reduction and you're playing a quest which has lots of extra threat action, lots of doomed cards, then this could be a little bit risky. So I like it. I think it's interesting. I'm curious to play with it. It's nice that it has lower starting threat, so you will have a bit of a lower threat to start with. And potentially, I mean, there's lots of nice cards you could play this with. As one cheaper is a really nice addition for lore. So curious to play around with this one. I could see a lot of players passing on it just because of the doomed is certainly a negative, and most heroes we don't associate with having negative effects. But you know, can quest for 2, defend for 2, it's okay, but certainly you're going to be playing Grima primarily for that ability to get cards for cheaper. So I think with some threat reduction built in, Grima could actually be a really interesting addition to a lore deck. So I thought today we'd start by taking a look at our neutral player cards, and certainly an interesting one here in Saruman. So first Grima, now Saruman, not people you would necessarily expect to be player cards, but very interesting nonetheless. So Saruman has a cost of 3, has 3 willpower, 5 attack, 4 defense, and 4 hit points. Very nice stats. Also has the Istari and Isengard keywords. Has Doomed 3, and yes, this is a player card. At the end of the round, discard Saruman from play. Response: after Saruman enters play, choose a non-unique enemy or location in the staging area. While Saruman is in play, the chosen enemy or location is considered to be out of play. So Saruman is certainly interesting, has the potential to be huge in a pinch, could certainly save the day, but the Doomed 3 is very questionable. So I think the abilities, card is going to function very much like Gandalf. It's going to come in, have some really nice abilities, you can use him for something, and then he's going to leave. So 3 willpower, 5 attack, and 4 defense, so it could be used for questing, attacking, or defending, of course. But Doomed 3 means you and any other players you're playing with will have to raise their threat by 3 to play him. So whereas Sneak Attack Gandalf is a really nice combo because you get to play Gandalf again, while Sneaking Attack Saruman and then bringing him out later means you're going to be using quite a bit of threat with the Doomed. Now, he could certainly come in handy in the right situation if you have a really devastating location or enemy, but it is non-unique. So the really nasty enemies usually, or the really nasty locations, do often tend to be unique, and so Saruman is not going to work to prevent those cards from messing up your game. But that being said, there are regular non-unique enemies with lots of threat, or maybe you don't have an extra blocker available. So I do see situations where Saruman could really come in and just save the day. And potentially with the right decks, he might be worth considering. If you have lots of threat reduction, if you're playing Lore Aragorn, then I think Saruman is something you can consider playing to keep for a pinch. Of course, you don't have to play him if you're not in a good situation. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's fun to have a card like this. The whole risk reward, do I want to have all these awesome abilities but raise my threat, adds an extra layer of thought and fun to the game. So Saruman, again, this is going to be controversial. Some people are probably going to stay away from this card, but I think for veteran players who are looking to experiment and have some new mechanics, he'll be an interesting play. So there you have Saruman. Our next neutral card is the Keys of Orthanc. It is unique and is an attachment and has a cost of 1. Reads: attached to a hero. After you raise your threat from the Doomed keyword, exhaust Keys of Orthanc to add 1 resource to attached hero's resource pool. So immediately, this card looks like a perfect addition to go with Grima. Obviously with Grima, or if you're playing a Doomed deck, and we're only just starting, but you'll notice by the end of this video, many of the player cards do have a very strong theme of Doomed. So you get a really good ability oftentimes, but you're going to pay for it in the cost of threat. So in that sort of deck, this could be good if you know there's going to be lots of Doomed. And potentially if you're in a quest where there's lots of Doomed, it's going to be good. But this goes really nicely with Grima and makes his ability even more potent. So of course he already makes cards cheaper by costing 1 less. So if you attach the Keys of Orthanc to him, well then you're going to get even more resources to pay for cheaper cards and you're going to be having Doomed anyways. So Keys of Orthanc I think is a really good card if you're playing Grima, but also could be a good card to include if you're playing a Doomed themed deck, which I think will be reserved probably for veteran players, as there's certainly a high risk factor to that, but it's interesting nonetheless. So there you have Keys of Orthanc. Okay, our last neutral card, the Seeing Stone, is an event, has 0 cost, which is nice, does have Doomed 1, so again raising your threat, and reads action, search your deck for a card with a Doomed keyword and add it to your hand, shuffle your deck. So a good card potentially. This is something you may want to include if you are playing a Doom themed deck. So if you really want Saruman and you want him in your hand so that you have him if you're in a pinch, then I think this card could be useful. But otherwise, very limited use, fits with the theme of this expansion. Is this going to be a card most people are going to play? No. But I think in the right deck, if you're playing Doomed, then the Seeing Stone is interesting. It's free. 1 threat isn't so bad. But of course, you're going to get a card that will also raise your threat. So again, that has to be managed. Moving on. So I figure, why don't we go through and look at all the Doomed cards first, and then go and look at the regular cards afterwards. So this one is for the Leadership Sphere. It's called the Legacy of Numenor. Has 0 cost, but has Doomed 4. Action, add 1 resource to each hero's resource pool. So here you are trading 4 threat for you and your partners to add 1 resource to each hero, but that would include your partners as well. So every hero on the table is going to get a resource, but every player in the game is going to have to raise their threat by 4. So again, that's going to be sketchy. Only so many decks are going to have threat reduction, so maybe this would be great if you have Lore Aragorn, but if you're playing with a partner who's playing mono tactics, then they might not appreciate that 4 extra threat. So it's something you're just going to have to take a look at your situation and figure if this is a card you're worth using. For me, I think Doomed 4 is really pushing it. I can see some of these cards where it's Doomed 1 or Doomed 2, but I think there's other cards to generate resources that's far more valuable than this one. So I would take a pass on Legacy of Numenor. Yes, in the right situation it might be good, but for me as Steward of Gondor, there's plenty of cards. Resourceful if you're playing Secrecy. There's lots of ways to get resources in this game, so adding 4 threat to everyone I think is not something you're going to want to make abundant use of. But I'd be curious to hear in the comments for this video to hear people's opinions on this new Doomed mechanic. Is this something you like? Is this something you see playing with? Or do you think this is just too risky and not something you really have fun playing? So maybe give your thoughts on Doomed. All right, moving on. So here we have Deep Knowledge. This is a lore event card, has a cost of 0, and reads Doomed 2, action, each player draws 2 cards. So I don't know. I feel like there are a lot of cards in the lore sphere particularly for card draw. I think there's ways to give other players card draw as well, and so I'm wondering if Doom 2 is really worth the ability to draw cards. Something like Daeron's Runes might be better. Of course, there's Bilbo Baggins, there's heroes that give you card draw. So in a pinch, yes, it's nice in that it's free, it costs no resources. So if you're really short on resources, then perhaps it's worth the 2 threat to draw 2 cards. I think you're really just going to have to evaluate your deck and decide, okay, I've gone through my deck, I realize I don't have any cards for card draw, I have a deck that doesn't have a whole lot of resource generation. Perhaps this card then would be worth including, but I think there's lots of ways to potentially get some card draw. Now it is each player, which is nice, but again the problem is that each player also has to raise their threat, so really worth evaluating. And it's interesting with this expansion in that it seems that you're going to have to collaboratively build decks with your partners as well. As some of your partners' decks, if you're just playing with a random person at a convention or a game night, they may not have prepared their deck for lots of doomed keywords and extra threat, so kind of an interesting new dynamic with this expansion.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.